Good afternoon, everyone. It is now 3:03. Welcome to the AISCA Game Changer series. This afternoon, we will be having a session on targeted procurement, where to from here. Before we commence, I'd just like to have some house rules. Firstly, I need to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Ayanda Ndeta, and I'm the VP for Southern Africa for AISCA. I'll start firstly with some house rules. Firstly, just to advise you that we are recording this session. So it's currently live on Facebook. And as we are recording the session, you are more than welcome to request a copy of the recording by contacting the AISCA office. We have our website, as well as emailing them in terms of the email address on the website. Secondly, we request that you please put yourselves on mute during the presentations. This just helps in terms for the presenters, it's less distracting. You may, at some time, if you do not put yourselves on mute, you may be put on mute by the administrators in the background. It doesn't mean that you must be silent throughout the session. You're more than welcome to take yourselves off mute and ask questions at the end of the presentation. If for whatever reason you do not want to ask a question, vocalize your question, you're also welcome to use the chat box. We'll be monitoring the chat box. You can put your questions in the chat box. You can also put comments, etc. And at the end of the presentation, we will also go through the chats and ask any questions that are in the chat, as well as share the relevant comments with the presenters. So you do have a few avenues to get your questions or your comments across via chat, or at the end of the session, then you're welcome to ask the questions, because we will have an opportunity for a discussion, which we hope will be a discussion, because while we have very knowledgeable presenters, we also recognize that those that are in the audience as well are as knowledgeable as our presenters that we have today. Speaking of the presenters, we have two presenters today, and we're very fortunate. We have firstly Professor Ambe, who those in the supply chain space will definitely know him. He's a leading scholar in the public procurement space, particularly within the African context and South Africa. And he's also the president of AISCA. Actually, I should say the president and founder of AISCA, and really a leading scholar in terms of supply chain public procurement, sits on various advisory boards, also in the space of supply chain public procurement. And we're very fortunate that he will be just providing a context in terms of our discussion today on targeted procurement, providing a context in order for Dr. Peter Volmink, who's our second speaker, to then take us through some presentation. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce, I will call him Dr. Peter if he does not mind. Dr. Peter is a practicing advocate at the Johannesburg Bar. He previously served as regional head of asset forfeiture unit, and thereafter as General Manager Legal Services in a major public entity. He has extensive experience in the legal aspects of supply chain management. He obtained his PhD in procurement law from Wits Law School, where he conducted research on the treatment of non-responsive bids in South African law. He teaches procurement law at postgraduate level at Stellenbosch and Wits University, and chairs the Special Interest Group on Public procurement law. He has also authored a number of articles on public procurement in South Africa. As you can see from this profile, we've really found someone who understands targeted procurement, who understands both as practicing in the space as well as in the academia, public procurement law, and is able to really share with us his vast experience in the particular topic. Having said that, so welcome, Dr. Peter, and thank you very much for gracing us this afternoon with your presentation. Having said that, I had indicated that we will firstly start with Professor Ambe, who will provide the context in terms of targeted procurement. And after he's set the context, we will then lead into Dr. Peter, who will take us through a presentation on the similar topic. So with that, Professor Ambe, thank you very much as well, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Can you kindly confirm if I'm audible and visible?
Yes, you are, Prof. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Once more, appreciation for the good work that you're doing and also for directing this engagement today. Ladies and gentlemen, I extend warm greetings to you all, and thank you for making the opportunity for us to share our insight on this topical issue, which is very, very profound and paramount, especially in South Africa at the moment. I want to also take the opportunity to thank our program director for the nice words and introduction that you have provided. Ladies and gentlemen, indeed, my role here would be for me to present a status in terms of setting the scene for this particular presentation. I would have loved to do a PowerPoint presentation, but sometimes there are things that are beyond our control in terms of electricity challenges. And those of us that are within South Africa, you know what I'm talking about. And so therefore, in the context of our presentation, I just want to draw attention that we all are aware of the fact that COVID-19 have indeed transformed the global socioeconomic landscape and have exposed weaknesses in our procurement and supply chain management systems. Many organizations have taken it and have made strides in order to improve their procurement systems. Because of the potential of procurement, many professionals we have called for the elevation of the profession due to its strategic nature and the contributions that we can be of benefit to once it has been implemented adequately. And you would agree with me that there are a lot of developments that have been implemented in different organizations in terms of the strategic role of procurement. And therefore, we are also mindful of the fact that obtaining value for money might be the primary objective of procurement in government. However, procurement play a critical role in implementing other socioeconomic policies, which in the past have often been dismissed or ignored, probably because of the technical know-how of those benefits which comes with efficient implementation of procurement practices in government. Procurement in government can have a positive impact on millions of people, as we have seen, and COVID-19 have demonstrated. And I would like to say that when it comes to government around the world, when they face budget constraints, especially during recession, one way have been to combat this corrective effect has been through using procurement strategically to target growth and other policy imperative, support SMME development in order to create job opportunities. It will be noted, ladies and gentlemen, that procurement is an instrument for government to attain various socioeconomic objectives. in many nations and constitute significant parts of a gross national product. And therefore, the key question that I would like all of us to address here, and I like what the program director indicated, by us being presenting today does not mean that we have the monopoly of knowledge. We believe that many of you may be more capable than us, and therefore your insight in this deliberation will be very, very important. That key question is, what is targeted procurement and where has it been implemented? I'll just take a few minutes just to dwell on that targeted procurement, it is an innovative procurement intervention strategy which has been designed and used to promote the participation of targeted enterprises and targeted labor in different governments. Targeted procurement, the nomenclature is used sometimes differently in different countries, how they see it fit. Sometimes we call it affirmative procurement. In the country, we've called it also preferential procurement. In other countries, they call it what we call positive procurement. It is a form of procurement that can be used and as an instrument to support government policy and strategy for stimulating growth and development. The key question, like I asked, so where has it been implemented? We know very well in the country, and I'll be coming to talk briefly about the 2017 regulation, which I believe it should be the center focus on our deliberation today. That many governments, both in developed and developing economies, have introduced preferential procurement or targeted procurement policies and programs to support small business development. I can tell you that the World Bank 2017 benchmarking procurement report actually revealed that over 180 economies show that a benchmarking that was done across 180 economies shows that about 47% of those countries indicate that they provide SMME specific procurement incentive programs. Therefore, they engage in some form of targeted procurement practices to support policy imperatives. These policies, programs that they have developed, varies from countries to country, and it varies from labor issues, equality issues, industrial development issues, economic growth issues, in addition to concerns such as poverty alleviations, wealth distribution. I can tell you that even in the US, the federal and state governments have several targeted procurement interventions that seeks to increase procurement and contracting with minority and women-owned businesses. For example, if you look at in Texas, they have a program where it supports what they call historical underutilized businesses, where those that have those certifications are being offered opportunities for subcontracting. In Singapore, bidding preferences are offered to local constructing firms, and suppliers who have joint venture initiatives are being preferred and supported. In Botswana, next door, they have implemented bid preferences scheme to promote engagement for citizen contractors. We have seen set-asides and reserve procurement strategies that have been used to encourage the participation of small businesses and minority-owned enterprises. As I've indicated, giving examples in the United States, South Africa, we all know, Indonesia, Malaysia. Now, talking about South Africa, for example, we all know that targeted procurement is being used as a means to implement an affirmative procurement policy, which is aimed at eradicating the legacy of apartheid, which left many South Africans distorted, that suffered from inequalities, inefficiency, and underdeveloped, and lack of developmental resources. It is being seen as a secondary tool to address long-term economic, socioeconomic issues. If we move to countries such as in Kenya, they have implemented an affirmative action through their articles of the Constitution to support mainstream gender and youth in public procurement and champion socioeconomic empowerment of disadvantaged individuals. The country has identified youth, women, and individuals with disabilities as persons or groups who were previously disadvantaged. This particular affirmative program was introduced with the support or introduced requiring that procuring entities allocate over 30% of their total procurement to these designated groups. In Uganda, ladies and gentlemen, we have the Buy Uganda Agenda policy, which aims to foster economic development. Through the Zambia Road Development Agencies, efforts were being made under large contract to subcontract to small and medium-sized contractors. All of these, ladies and gentlemen, indicates that many countries are using procurement strategically as a policy to target designated group to enhance sustained inclusive growth and economic development. We are aware that despite these policy provisions, there are many challenges in terms of corruption, in terms of human capital development, monitoring and evaluations, just to name a few, that hinders the efficient functioning of these policy programs. Now, if we look at the situation, which is a center part of our conversation today in South Africa, as I've earlier indicated, one of the key regulations that support targeted procurement is in contention of court order. We have had a lot of deliberations amongst procurement professionals on the status of the court order and implications for government procurement in the country. Also, there have been a lot of misunderstanding on the part of, or there have been misunderstanding on the part of National Treasury as well, despite the fact that it has that particular role of providing leadership and giving directions on procurement matters in the country. Many SCM practitioners at the moment, they find it difficult, and the way forward on procurement as a strategic tool is in kind of what I say in limbo, and therefore leadership and clear directions is required to guide the way forward. In line with that, ladies and gentlemen, I have with me my peers and colleague, Dr. Peter, who will then dwell and focus on the context of South Africa by answering the question, targeted procurement, where to from here. And in the course of the deliberation, some of the key themes would be outlined in terms of the constitutional principles of remedial equality as a basis for targeted procurement measures in South Africa, analysis of the recent court ruling of the Constitutional Court in the Afri business case, the inclusion of pre-qualification on criteria on supply chain management policies of institutions, key lessons from previous cases in which targeted procurement measures were declared invalid by the court. I want to thank you very much for the opportunity allowing me to provide the setting of the scene, our esteemed program director, and thank you, colleagues, for listening. We'll now give opportunity to Dr. Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ambe and Program Director. I hope you can all see me and hear me loud and clear. First and foremost, let me thank you for the opportunity and, in fact, the privilege to come and share some thoughts with you on this critical topic that we are all grappling with, namely the important issue of targeted procurement, how we structure it, and how we can protect it against applications and actions designed to discredit those important initiatives. As Prof. Ambe has said, we are not exactly making history when we embark on targeted procurement measures. It is done in various parts of the world and in countries as diverse as the United States, Namibia, Kenya, and so on and so forth. It's also good to see a number of colleagues whose names I see in the list of participants, and good to be with you. I'm going to share my screen, which I hope you are able to see. Ayanda, Program Director, can you just confirm that you can see it?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Okay, so there are really 4 issues that I want to discuss with you. The first is this principle of remedial equality. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on that because I think it is a fairly well-established principle in South Africa that remedial equality is a central tenet of the Constitution. The second topic relates to key lessons from previous cases. And the question may well be asked that if remedial equality is as important as you say it is, and if the importance of transformation measures is as you claim it is, why is it that so many cases geared at enhancing or promoting targeted procurement have been unsuccessful, have been shut down by the courts? And what are the lessons that we need to learn from that? I will then go into a brief discussion on the Agribusiness decision and provide a critique of the Constitutional Court's position in Agribusiness. And then I will end off talking about the use of race and gender pre-qualifications in SCM policies. Organs of state are required to have SCM policies in place. I think it is by January or so of next year. The question is, can one include race and gender pre-qualifications in SCM policies currently? I will share my views on that, and I'd be very interested if you have any contrary views as well. But just a brief issue of terminology. When I speak about targeted procurement, I will be referring to a range of measures, not just set-asides, a range of measures that's designed to promote disadvantaged persons through the use of public procurement. And they can range from set-asides to preference points to subcontracting to joint ventures and so on and so forth. When I talk about set-asides, I'm going to refer to a program whereby we ring-fence a particular contract or a particular category of contracts for designated groups. And when I speak about pre-qualification, I'm really referring to minimum eligibility criteria. You can call it filters if you like, to allow certain participants to be part of a procurement event. So let me deal with just some background issues. I think you would all be familiar with the fact that the key provisions pertaining to the advancement of people who have suffered historical discrimination and current discrimination, should I add, those sections are, of course, the Equality Clause of Section 9 and Section 217. There's the PPPFA, the BE Act, the Unemployment Equity Act, and the Promotion and Combating of Unfair Discrimination Act. We all know that the PPPFA has served its purpose and it should be repealed. The sooner, the better. And we know that Section 2173 of the Constitution says that whatever preferential procurement policies you put in place, those must be implemented in terms of national legislation. Currently, that national legislation is the PPPFA, but any future legislation will also have to be promulgated in terms of Section 2173 of the Constitution. We are well familiar with the problems associated with the PPPFA, that it is overly restrictive. It limits the entire concept of categories of preference that Section 2172 speaks about. It limits that to a preference point system. The question is, what should take the place of the PPPFA? It's all very well to say, yes, we want the PPPFA to go, but what is to take its place? And colleagues, we need to grapple with this, because I think when the PPPFA was enacted, there was very limited participation and input from civil society in general and the procurement community, I think in particular. Having learned from that inaction on the part of the broader society, I think that the new bill, when the second version of it comes out, should again cause us to engage in a very robust manner with those provisions. So I think some of the key challenges that we would have to deal with relates to the fact that we need to structure targeted procurement measures in a manner that minimizes the likelihood of constitutional and legal challenges. Let's be frank, whatever targeted procurement measures are going to be enacted, they are going to be the subject of constitutional and legal challenges. What is important is that we minimize the prospects of successful challenge. And understand why it is that the courts have not been particularly happy with the way that has been done in the past. We also need to ensure that targeted procurement measures are designed to ensure the greatest impact on development and poverty eradication. That, after all, is the very foundation of why we say we need targeted procurement measures. So to ensure greatest impact on development would be a key objective. Of course, thirdly, it's important that we insulate targeted procurement measures from being repurposed, if you like, to serve corrupt ends. It is an Achilles heel of targeted procurement measures, as good as they are, and as constitutionally permissible as they are, but they are vulnerable to abuse and to being repurposed to serve nefarious and corrupt ends. Also, it's important that we balance policy objectives against the other objectives of fairness, cost effectiveness, and competitiveness. Now, we know that the Constitution says that we must be fair, cost effective, and competitive, and so on. And it says that those principles does not inhibit or doesn't prevent the state from taking measures aimed at the advancement of designated groups. So a key issue is how do we balance those policy objectives against each other? I think another area of challenge would be to ensure alignment between policy statements on the one hand and the legislative framework on the other hand. Anyone who works in the area of procurement will know that there are very grand policy statements about, such as the Black industrialists policy, the competitive supplier development policy, and many others, which really are quite progressive documents. But if you balance those policy statements against what the legislation permits, then we see that there is a significant gap between policy and legislation, and that's one of the key things that we need to ensure is addressed. And then, of course, putting in place effective monitoring and evaluation processes. So, and Professor Ambe has alluded to this, that procurement is very often used as a policy instrument in various parts of the world. The traditional approach has always been that to say that the primary purpose of procurement is to procure goods and services at the best price, and that's it. And of course, pre-94, that was the primary way in which procurement was approached. If you read the old State Tender Board Act and other pieces of legislation related to that. And perhaps to some extent, it is still reflected in the 80-20-90-10 principle, in that 90 points are allocated to price and 10 to transformation objectives. But of course, increasingly, procurement is seen as quite critical to economic development. Socioeconomic goals are not viewed only as secondary objectives of procurement, but they are part and parcel of what a procurement program would seek to attain. So in South Africa and in many parts of the world, there is no difficulty with the concept of using and leveraging of government spend to deracialize the economy, strive for a greater and a more inclusive economy, stimulate local manufacturing, promote fair labor practices, environmentally friendly products, and so on and so forth. This is a somewhat busy slide, but there are two cases from the Constitutional Court where this principle was endorsed. And the first one is the well-known All-Pay case, where Justice Furneman said that it is difficult to think of a more fundamentally mandatory and material condition prescribed by the constitutional and legislative procurement framework than objectively determined empowerment credentials. He says it's difficult to think of something that is more fundamental to procurement than legitimate empowerment credentials. And of course, in the minority judgment in Agribusiness, it was said that the procurement process is a critical part of a functional government service delivery mechanism. Our Constitution explicitly mandates that this process takes on not only the pragmatic purpose of attaining services or supplies, but the additional aim of achieving societal transformation. We are all familiar with what Section 217 says, and in particular, Section 2172, but just for a very brief summary would suffice. So Section 2172 allows for what it calls categories of preference in the allocation of contracts. Section 2172 doesn't say you must only have a preference point system based on 80-20-90-10. it has a broader concept that we can embrace categories of preference. Was that a question, or okay, maybe it was just someone who needed to unmute, to mute. And then, of course, the section 217, as I've indicated, says that all of those good things about fairness and competitiveness, it does not prevent organs of state from implementing preferential procurement measures. Perhaps with the benefit of hindsight and in retrospect, it could have been worded a bit more strongly. You know, when the Constitution says that those 2171 principles do not prevent organs of state from implementing preferential procurement measures, it sounds like it is more permissive than instructive. In other words, it says, well, you can, if you want to, you are permitted to do this. Perhaps, as I say, with the benefit of hindsight, it may have been a bit more directory than permissive, as we've seen, of course, in the BEE Act. And what 2172 then also goes on to talk about is it allows for a range of measures. It says it allows for other measures over and above categories of preference to be taken into account. And though the range of measures could include, and I won't go into all of this, but set-asides, there could be different categories of preference. There could be product or service specification where you say in the manufacture of this product or for this service, I would want the use of local labor. I want to ensure compliance with human rights, no child labor, compliance with environmental standards, et cetera, unbundling, subcontracting, and so on and so forth. The clause 26 of the bill, of the procurement bill, is a lot more forthright about set-asides. It allows for set-asides. Of course, the problem is the bill, if you read it, so the last version that came out, I think about 2 years ago or so, it's very brief on the issue of preferential procurement. In fact, there's only one section that deals with it, but it does allow quite unambiguously for a general use of set-asides. And the concept of set-asides in the bill has wider application than just set-asides based on race and gender. So under the bill, for instance, you can target local companies, not just local to South Africa, but local to a particular region. You can try and stimulate local technology by saying we're going to set aside the acquisition of this product to local companies which produce this type of technology. You can set aside to companies based in rural areas. So there's a range of bases upon which you can set aside. I think, though, and we will have to look out for this in the second version of the bill when that comes out, is for greater clarity and more clear guiding principles on how set-asides ought to be used. How do we avoid overreach and abuse? How do we balance transformation, inclusiveness, economic growth, fairness, rationality, cost effectiveness, and so on and so forth? The principle of remedial equality, I think, is well established. There is a well-known case. Perhaps there are people in the audience who have a legal background and they may know exactly what I'm talking about. But there is a well-known case from the Constitutional Court called the Van Heerden case. Van Heerden versus Minister of Finance. Actually, it's Minister of Finance versus Van Heerden, where the court said the following: if absent a positive commitment progressively to eradicate socially constructed barriers to equality and to root out systematic or institutionalized underprivilege, the constitutional promise of equality before the law and its equal protection and benefit must, in the context of our country, ring hollow. So in other words, the promise of equality is probably the greatest promise that lies at the heart of the Constitution. And what the Constitutional Court is saying is that if you don't have a positive commitment progressively to eradicate those barriers to equality, those promises that were made in 1996 and prior to that, in the interim constitution of 1993, those promises will then ring hollow. So I will make the following statements. That the South African Constitution is not a classic neoliberal document that is based only on the principle of formal equality before the law. I'm going to take the 14th Amendment of the American Constitution as an example. It just says that there shall be equal protection of the law. Everyone is treated the same, and we give equal protection to anyone regardless of race and gender and so on and so forth. But as Justice Moseneke said in the Barnard case, he said that at the heart of our Constitution lies a transformative mission, which hopes to have us reimagine power relations within society. So our Constitution is not race neutral. It is different from other constitutions, notably the American constitutions, where affirmative action measures have been approached as if they are suspect actions, because they draw a differentiation based on race or gender or whatever. And in American jurisprudence, they are subjected to what's called heightened scrutiny. The state must be able to show what it calls a strong or a compelling governmental purpose if those affirmative action measures are to be upheld. The South African Constitution says that equality can't be attained through formal declarations that everyone is equal, nor can you attain it by raising a new flag or singing a new anthem or adopting a new constitution. And the courts have said that a system which treats unequals as if they are equal actually perpetuates inequality. So there's no contradiction between the commitment to fair and equal treatment that we see in section 2171 and the use of remedial measures in 2172. As a matter of fact, the Constitutional Court has expressed a preference for interestingly, the Afrikaans word for affirmative action is rechtstellende actie. Translated, it means corrective action. And the Concord said that actually places the correct emphasis where it belongs. It is corrective action as opposed to just affirmative action. Well, we know about, I've referred earlier to the importance of section 9.2 of the Constitution. And one of the things that section 9.2 states is it says that to promote the achievement of equality, legislative and other measures designed to protect or advance persons or categories of persons may be taken. And I'll come back to that word design, because the courts have said if you come with haphazard measures, not well thought out, they are not designed properly, and they fall short of the section 9.2 standard. But we will get to that in a short while. But the principle, though, is that section 9.2, as an instrument of transformation, is powerful and unapologetic, to use the words of the Constitutional Court in the Barnard case. So it is not a half-hearted statement. It is an unapologetic statement that measures can be taken to advance people who have been the victims of unfair discrimination in the past. And if those remedial measures are properly designed and they fall within the ambit of section 9.2, then they are not presumptively unfair. What do I mean by presumptively unfair? Well, section 9 says that if you discriminate between people on the basis of race or gender, or any of those suspect categories, then that discrimination is presumed to be unfair, and those who are committing the discrimination must prove that it is fair. But the Constitutional Court says if it is a remedial measure falling within the ambit of Section 9(2), then there's no presumptive fairness or presumptive unfairness, rather, about the measure. And it may be so that the non-designated groups will suffer prejudice of some sort, in that they may be excluded from certain opportunities, but that prejudice is incidental, but it is not the main purpose or the main target of the remedial measures in question. Let me draw an illustration of what I'm talking about with reference to the distribution of COVID relief funds. So during this awful pandemic that we have just been through, COVID relief funds were distributed taking a range of factors into account. One of those factors included race, and also gender, age, and disability, etc. There were some cases, DA versus President of the Republic of South Africa and Solidarity versus the Minister of Small Business Development, where the applicants went to court and said there's no law which empowers the use of these criteria for the distribution of disaster relief funds. At the level of the High Court, that argument was rejected. I will tell you later about what happened at the SCA around this issue of distribution of COVID relief funds. But at the level of the High Court, the court said that you can't interpret the Disaster Management Act outside of the context in which it must be applied. And the court said it is the poor and disadvantaged who bore the brunt of the pandemic in terms of social distancing, access to clean water, the impact on township businesses. So the court said, don't read the legislation outside of the context in which it must operate. And the court also noted that although race and gender and so on did play a role in the allocation of funds, its weighting was very slight. It was only between 2 and 8% of the available points. And the High Court there said that people who enjoy fewer resources as a result of historical injustice should enjoy greater preference for state-funded assistance. And there was nothing shameful or objectionable about including race as a factor, said the High Court. Well, as I said, I'll tell you in a moment that things took a different turn on appeal, but I'll return to that shortly. Well, having said all of those good things about transformation and the importance of remedial equality and what Section 9(2) and Section 2172 permits, there is something called transformative tension. And it is something that the Constitutional Court also highlighted in the Barnard case. They said that remedial measures can give rise to what's called transformative tension, because on the one hand, we've got this commitment to remedial equality, but on the other hand, we've got a commitment to a non-racial and non-sexist society. And sometimes those two objectives exist in tension with each other. It doesn't mean that you can't pursue both, but we must be aware that they do exist in tension. The other point that was made is that the advancement of multiple groups of previously disadvantaged persons don't neatly overlap with each other. The interests, say, of Black men and Black women may not overlap neatly. Different groups who fall into the category of Black persons, African, colored, and Indian, the interests of those groups don't always neatly overlap. So and one has to mediate those tensions. Another factor, of course, is that remedial measures often utilize racial classifications that were wielded in the past. We all speak about a white person. Where is the definition of what a white person, an African person, a colored person, an Indian person? Where is that? We must go to the old population registration classifications to look at those absurd definitions that you will find there of who falls into which category. And then another aspect which the court has emphasized is that race and gender are the most important signifiers of disadvantage in South Africa, but they are not the only signifiers of disadvantage. And we must be conscious of what the court called shifting patterns of discrimination, social differentiation, and systematic underprivilege. And so affirmative action measures should be applied generously to address whatever the pattern of discrimination and social differentiation may be. And it could be urban versus rural. That is a growing gap of underprivilege that needs to be addressed through affirmative action measures, to use but one example. And so what the court has done in the Van Heerden case, it says, if you are going to have a transformative measure that will withstand scrutiny, there's a certain test, and we don't have time to get into it because I'm also conscious of time here, but it said that there's a three-legged test. The first is that you must be able to show that the remedial measure is aimed at the protection or advancement of a disadvantaged class. You must be able to show that the majority of people who fall into this disadvantaged class have in fact suffered and are the victims of disadvantage. It may be so that there are a few people who fall into that class who can't show an actual history or experience of prejudice or disadvantage, but the group that you are targeting, the overwhelming majority must be able to demonstrate some form of disadvantage. The other leg to the test is they said the measure must be designed to protect or advance those persons. So if a measure is haphazard, if it is poorly conceived, if it is arbitrary, capricious, then it is not designed to achieve the objective. And the third leg, of course, is that it must promote the ultimate objective, is that it must be aimed at the achievement of equality. The long-term goal must be the establishment of a non-racial, non-sexist society in which people are treated with equal worth and dignity. So a measure which meets the three legs of this test won't be presumed to be unfair, and in fact, it won't be regarded as unfair. Having said that, then, what are the key lessons? Why is it that there are so many cases that do go, or so many transformation measures that do go belly up when they are challenged? Well, I think broadly, and we'll look at the specific lessons in a moment, we will see that these transformation measures either had flaws in their design, or there was nothing wrong with the design, but the manner of implementation, the way in which it was implemented, gave rise to legal challenge. And there's about 7 or 8 key lessons that I just want to touch on quickly. So I think the first lesson is the importance of legality. Whether it is the PPPFA or anything else that replaces the PPPFA, the new act that will come, we have to operate within the 4 corners of that legislation. So the principle of legality is, of course, fundamental to the rule of law. And the principle is that if you're a public institution, you can't exercise any power except those that have been conferred on you, either expressly or impliedly by the law. And even with the best of intentions and with the best will in the world, you can't operate outside of the legal framework. So colleagues, that's why it's so important that the legal framework is an enabling one, that the legal framework steps into the breadth of the scope that's created by Section 2172 of the Constitution. And there have been various cases that have been challenged on the basis of legality. You will be familiar with some of them, of course, Agribusiness being the most recent. But of course, you would know about the AXA versus Imperial case, where AXA issued a request for a proposal for a rental concession. And AXA said, we are going to require a minimum Black ownership of 51% as a pre-qualification. And instead of 90-10 or 80-20, we're going to allocate 50 points for price and 50 for preference. And they said that the reason why they feel that they can do so is because they are just granting concessions and they are not procuring goods and services. They're not incurring any expense. But of course, as we all know, the Supreme Court of Appeal held that even concession agreements, even those agreements where you are not spending money, you are actually getting in money from a service provider, that even those agreements are subject to Section 217 and the PPPFA. And it said AXA can't come with its own custom-made pre-qualification criteria that deviates from the regulatory framework. I mean, I think you would be aware of that judgment, but it illustrates the centrality of legality and that one can't step outside of that framework. Another case I'll mention briefly is Rainbow Civils versus Minister of Transport. And I have the references to most of these cases at the end of the presentation, and you will see it when you receive it. But in the Rainbow Civils case, there was great emphasis placed on the fact that the winning bidder was a Black female-owned company, and that weighed quite heavily in the awarding of the tender. But the court struck it down because it said there's nothing in the empowering legislation which affords the organ of state a discretion to attach a weight to race and gender over and above the BEE points. So the next important lesson I want to draw your attention to is the importance of clarity, that whatever measures we put in place, whatever your RFP conditions are or your criteria for the allocation of preference, clarity is fundamental. So let's come back to that COVID case that I was telling, the COVID relief fund for SMMEs. I mentioned earlier that the court had no problem with the broad principle that you can use targeted or empowerment measures even for the distribution of COVID funds. But in this case, they had great problems with the lack of clarity with how this is to be done. So there, the fund rules or the rules for the distribution of the funds simply said that priority will be given to businesses owned by women, youth, and disabled. And the court said, but there's no guidance for the decision maker. Do white women receive the same score or the same priority as Black women? Do the disabled get the same priority as youth? And the point which they emphasized is that distribution of government funds or any other government system where you allocate benefits, it must be based on a predictable system. So the system must provide guidance to the decision maker, and it must be stated in advance how factors are to be weighed against each other. And without that clarity, dear colleagues, we open the door for corruption because we are not clear about how these factors are supposed to be weighed. And so corruption then becomes a real possibility. corruption thrives in uncertainty and vagueness. And that, I think, is an important lesson here. So by contrast, the case of Solidarity versus the Minister of Small Business Development, there the allocation of points was a lot clearer. And the court had no problems upholding the decision. But of course, it got overturned by the SCA, as you will hear shortly. Even in that AXA versus Imperial case, there was, again, the problem of uncertainty and clarity, because the bid document says that we will award to the top scoring bidder, but we will use what it called transformational imperatives as an objective criteria to overlook that bidder and award to the highest, to a bidder other than the highest scoring bidder. And understandably, the SCA said this was unacceptably vague, and they struck it down. The standard that is expected is not 100% clarity. So let's be clear about something. We are not saying that things must be absolutely certain without a shadow of uncertainty. The standard that is set by the law is that of what's called reasonable lucidity. Is the document reasonably clear to any person reading it, or is it so riddled with uncertainty that no one can actually understand what is expected of them? So clarity, I think, is the second issue. The third issue I want to mention very briefly is that your statutory powers should be used only for the purpose for which it was given. And that is the problem which the SCA had with the COVID Relief Fund case, when the matter got to that level in the matter of AfriForum versus the Minister of Tourism. The court said that the power given for a particular purpose can't be redirected at a different purpose, no matter how laudable the objective may be. In that case, the minister said that she felt obliged by the BEE Act to include BEE criteria for the distribution of COVID relief funds. And we know that the BEE Act in Section 21E says that organs of state must apply the relevant codes of good practice when determining criteria for awarding incentives, grants, investment schemes in support of BEE. And the minister felt that she was acting in accordance with that. But the SCA said that is an error of law. You can't use the Disaster Management Act to advance empowerment goals. The court said that the statutory powers under the Disaster Management Act can only be used for the purpose for which it was intended, and that is to address the impact of the disaster. And you can't redirect that purpose at something else. You'll notice the High Courts I mentioned earlier had a different approach to this. Time doesn't permit us, but you will see that same error of law, using statutory powers for purposes for which it was not intended, also infected the case of AXA versus Imperial. I think it's the fourth key aspect that I want to highlight is that of rigidity versus flexibility. Can our targeted procurement measures be rigid, or must it be flexible? Well, I said that we can't fault transformational goals in principle, but we have seen that the process that gets employed in pursuit of those goals often is faulted. And a classic case is Magistrates Commission versus Lawrence, which also went to the SCA. Now, this is not a procurement case, colleagues. This is an employment equity case where a magistrate applied for the position, but he was declined based on what the court felt was a targeted exclusion of white males. So the Section 15 of the Employment Equity Act says that affirmative action measures may include preferential treatment, and it can include numerical goals, but it must exclude quotas. And so the principle established there is that you can't establish an absolute barrier to employment of people who fall outside of the designated groups. You can't have the type of job reservation program in place. The court also felt that an overly rigid, overly exclusive or exclusive system, it disadvantages not only the people who belong to the non-designated group, but even disadvantages the designated group, because there is an insidious notion that the designated group only got the contract, or only got the job, or only got the benefit, or whatever the case may be, based because of their race or their gender. And that affects dignity issues, said the court as well. So you can't fetter the discretion of the body who has to make the appointment. But the point I make here, though, and it is perhaps something I just want to spend a minute or two on. Let's not draw the wrong lessons and conclude that targeted procurement measures must never be rigid, or it can never be exclusionary. If you have a pre-qualification based on race and gender, by its very nature, those pre-qualifications are rigid and they are exclusionary. But the minority in Agribusiness, in fact, said that may be so, but they are effective tools to promote economic redress. So the point here is that we can't simply invalidate all affirmative action measures on the grounds of it being rigid. It must be analyzed in what the Constitutional Court called a situation-sensitive manner. What is the situation that we are dealing with? Rather than saying all rigidity, all quotas, whatever, that is automatically out. In this case of the South African insolvency practitioners, the High Court dealt with what was a kind of a quasi-procurement case. There, the court also felt that quotas are not permissible, even if it's even outside of the context of employment equity. But the Constitutional Court did not adopt such a hard and fast position. It says, look at it in a situation-sensitive manner. So racial quotas can, for example, be allowed in other contexts. An example would be the composition of the Legal Practice Council. There's a certain number of women and a certain number of men. There must be a certain number of Black persons versus white persons. And that case was decided, in fact, by the Cape High Court about 2 years ago. There's the issue of sport quotas. I haven't come across a case where the courts have struck down the allocation of quotas in a sporting context. So it is true that the Employment Equity Act prohibits rigid quotas, but there is no general prohibition on the use of rigid criteria in other areas, particularly such as procurement. What is important is that when you use pre-qualifications, they must be rational and they must be based on a proper market analysis. There was, I think, in the old ASGISA policy statement, there was what was called a 10 products initiative, where government said we are going to limit the acquisition of these 10 products solely to SMMEs or Black-owned SMMEs. But it wasn't well developed. It wasn't designed properly. There was no adequate market analysis that went into it, and it was not pursued. So let's talk about the fifth lesson, and that is the importance of that your measure must be rational. There must be a rational connection between this targeted procurement measure, the remedial measure, and what you seek to achieve. And the standard which the courts have outlined is they said the measure must be reasonably capable of achieving its objective, which is the protection or advancement of designated groups. You don't need 100% guarantee that it is going to advance or protect the designated group, but there must be at least a reasonable level of certainty that it is capable of achieving the objective. But a measure, as I've indicated before, which is arbitrary, haphazard, or based on what the court called naked preference. You'll just say, well, we prefer to award to a designated group in this particular case. That will be struck down as irrational. And the case that I want to share with you is the South African Restructuring and Insolvency Practitioners case. In this case, and it's quite interesting, bear with me, I know the slide is a little bit difficult to read because of the table that I've put in at the bottom, but in essence, what happened is the Minister of Justice introduced a roster system, which was to accelerate the appointment of historically disadvantaged persons as liquidators of insolvent companies. And the minister says this, the profession of liquidators is dominated by white males, and we want to put in place a measure which will accelerate the advancement of people other than white males. So the minister had a roster, and you had to appoint people in accordance with a certain ratio. Category 4 persons, there's a category B, C, and D, and you had to appoint first 4 persons from category A, and then 3 persons from category B, and then 2 persons from category C, 1 person from category D before you go back to category A again. And category A consisted of African, colored, Indian, and Chinese females who became citizens before the 27th of April. Category B consisted of African, colored, Indian, and Chinese males who became citizens before the 27th of April, 1994. Category C was made up of white females who became citizens before April 1994. And then category D was kind of everyone else, African, colored, Indian, Chinese females and males and white females who became South African citizens after the 27th of April, 1994, and also all white males were South African citizens. They all got put into category D. And the problem which the court had is it said that this mechanical application of a roster system is not capable of achieving transformation of the insolvency industry. It said that in that category D, where you just lump everyone together who was born after 94 with white males, the court said that you are effectively punishing Black people who were given citizenship in the homeland, so-called homelands, who could only become citizens after the 27th of April, 1994. So they find themselves in the same category as white males. And young people who were born after the 27th of April, 1994 also are put into that category. And so the court said that a measure that you say is designed to promote disadvantaged people can't treat them in the same manner as the advantaged class. It's irrational. And if a policy in an arbitrary way differentiates between people who fall within the disadvantaged class. And there were various other reasons which you can look at for yourself. But it's critical that we be able to show that the measure that we have adopted is reasonably capable of achieving its objective. It is rational, it is well thought out, and clear. So that's the rationality principle that I wanted to talk about. Rushing along, there is the importance of market analysis. We have seen that in AXA versus that Imperial case, there was very poor market analysis to justify the pre-qualification criteria. that were used, and even more so in that insolvency practitioners case. There, the race and gender profiles in the different categories were incorrect. People were described as black female, then they were white female, and vice versa. And the market analysis and the entire roster system was based on faulty data. So when you are challenged, colleagues, one of the things that they will look at is the quality of the market analysis. Does it justify a pre-qualification? Does it justify an exclusive approach to this particular transaction? What is the market analysis telling us? And if the market analysis is faulty, the courts are going to be concerned about whether there was a rational basis to it. The court will not interfere simply because they disagree with your analysis or because they think a different approach could have been adopted, but the courts will interfere if they say, but it doesn't make sense. There is no basis upon which you can use this market analysis to justify the pre-qualification in this particular case. I think I've already kind of dealt with the Lawrence case, Magistrates Commission versus Lawrence, but the important point here is the courts have said that the measure that you adopt should not amount to an abuse of power or impose substantial or undue harm on the non-designated group or be imposed with a punitive intent. So the question isn't whether the measure is going to impact the non-designated group negatively. Obviously, if you say this is for Black-owned EMEs or QSEs or large enterprises, anyone who doesn't meet that standard, i.e. the non-designated group, is going to be affected negatively. But the question is whether the measure places a disproportionate burden on the non-designated group. If you say from now on, no tender or no contract will be awarded to persons falling within a non-designated group, that, as by way of example, that would have a disproportionate burden. And then, just before I summarize on this, the last lesson relates to double counting. It is a lesson which we learned from the PPPFA, of course, but the principle is that race and gender can't be taken into account twice. So under the PPPFA, race and gender informs the BEE score, and you get your points out of 10. But you can't revisit those factors again under the name of objective criteria to justify an award to someone else. Now, that's a lesson from the PPPFA, but we must be mindful of that lesson as we search for alternatives to the PPPFA, that we be careful about double counting and revisiting aspects on which points have already been adopted. So if you summarize this, then it would seem to lead to the following lessons: that set-aside measures have a better chance of surviving judicial scrutiny if they are informed by a proper market analysis, if they are rational, if they are limited in scope and duration, if they are directed at a specific class of beneficiaries, if the impact on the non-favored class is not disproportionate, and the principles of competitiveness and cost effectiveness are not undermined to a material degree. In the last 5 minutes or so, before we invite open discussion, a few very brief points on the Afri-Business case. And I'm sure you've had lots of discussion in your own areas and your own organizations about it. But in this slide, which I won't be able to go through in detail, the minority judgment here, it said that the regulations are valid. There's nothing wrong with the regulations. And I've tried to summarize the key points of the minority judgment on the left and what the majority judgment said on the right. And the key point that the minority said is that these regulations are necessary or expedient to promote the objectives of the Act. And the minority said that the objects of the Act are economic inclusion, preference, and advancement. The majority said, no, the regulations can only work in order to make the Act work. The regulations can't have a greater purpose than the Act itself. The regulations can't have a life of their own, almost detached from the ambit of the Empowering Act. And the problem which the majority had with the regulations is they said the minister has overstepped his mark. The regulations serve as a preferential procurement policy, but Section 2.1 of the PPPFA says it is organs of state who must determine their own preferential policies and implement it within the framework of the Act. Look, there's lots that one can say about agribusiness, and we can maybe get into it in some discussion if you like, but I don't see how the regulations can be regarded as policy in breach of Section 2.1. I'd have thought that the regulations create a framework within which organs of state are to develop their own policy. The bigger problem is that the majority was silent on the most important issue before it, and that is the legality of the pre-qualification criteria. That is where we needed guidance. What the majority said is, well, Minister, if you are not happy with the way organs of state are performing in terms of empowerment, you must go and engage them politically. Now, the court did not explain what it meant by going to engage with organs of state politically. No amount of political engagement with organs of state can change the statutory framework within which organs of state find themselves. And so one has this dichotomy. On the one hand, organs of state are told you must operate strictly within the ambit of the law. You can't overstep that mark. On the other hand, there can be sort of political engagements with the organs of state to say, why are you not doing more? Why are you not being more robust about these things? We know, of course, about the severe fragmentation, or the severe disruption, rather, that this judgment has caused. It has now been cleared up in that second Saka Liga judgment. And we can talk about the PPPFA circular that has come out during the discussion. The biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems that I have with a judgment, is that it's going to lead to fragmentation. Each organ of state develops its own preferential procurement policies, unguided to a large extent by the 2017 regulations. There's now new draft regulations, which is very generic, but the policies of Department A could be very different to Institution B and Institution C. And you can imagine the level of uncertainty and frustration when bidders must deal with Department A, whose preferential procurement policies is one thing, Department B says a different thing, C, D, and so on and so forth. I said 5 minutes, and now I'm going to go into injury time and take maybe another minute. And that is to say that I would be cautious about including preferential procurement policies at this point in SCM policies of institutions. Even if you agree with the minority judgment and you like their way of reasoning about race and gender pre-qualifications, you must be mindful of the fact that it is still just a minority view, and a minority judgment is just that. It's a minority judgment. It's a non-binding minority view, and the majority, except for the fact that it gave a broad nod in favor of substantive equality and remedial equality, it didn't expressly endorse the views of the minority. In fact, it criticized the views of the minority. So I would be mindful of the fact that when you write your preferential procurement policies, you must still do so, to use the words of the PPPFA, within the framework outlined in section 2, which is based on the preference point system. And my own view is that it may be more prudent to align your SCM policies to the new PPPFA regulations when they come out, or await entirely new legislation, which should be designed to encapsulate the principles of section 2172 to a much greater extent. So, Program Director, I've taken up quite a bit of injury time, as I say, but I think that is where my presentation ends. And perhaps we can go into a time of discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peter. It's, I mean, you could go on and we'd still be engaged and interested, because this is really a very topical issue that affects a lot of us. So thank you very much. And you've really broken it down, making us understand all the nuances, all the areas that we need to look out for, and what targeted procurement actually means. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to take this opportunity to indicate if anyone has any questions. They are welcome to raise their hand and take themselves off their mic and ask a question. In the absence, or whilst people are still thinking about that, I do have a question that actually came from, interestingly enough, from our Facebook followers that had a question. And the question is coming from Mr. Ncube, where he indicates, and I'm going to say it as is, this has been a key responsibility for SCM in the public sector in particular. However, as practitioners, we seem to be challenged in operationalizing or implementing this strategy, leading to a lot of dissatisfaction by internal clients and contestations by non-considered or losing suppliers. Any thoughts on creating efficiencies in the implementation of this procurement strategy and any other complementary measures? It's quite an open-ended, loaded question, Dr. Peter, but if you could perhaps just take a stab at it to help us, the practitioners.
Look, I think that the colleague has put his or her finger on an important issue, and that is the dissatisfaction from either, I think you made reference to the internal end users, or losing suppliers who are unhappy with the way in which an empowerment measure or a preferential procurement measure may have been implemented. And it's a difficult tension to mediate. And coming from a legal background, you know, one tends to go to the law and say, but the law does not permit us to do anything more than what we have already done. With the best will in the world, we would have liked to do more. But if we do more, there's going to be not only a legal challenge, there's going to be a finding of irregular expenditure, there's going to be audit issues, there's going to be a range of other consequences which follow. Does that make the unhappiness go away? Of course not. And I think we have to be very realistic about this. But within the ambit that we have, within the narrow, restrictive ambit, there's very little that one can do over and above what the legislation permits. So, for example, one could have certain developmental clauses put into the contract to say that the winning bidder must either subcontract or form JVs or whatever with a Black-owned business or an entity from a designated class. And one can look at other measures like that. But the frustration is that is not enough. And the sooner we get to the space where we can employ new legislation, the better. So the answer that I can give is not, it doesn't satisfy me, because I can only refer the person who asked the question to the restrictive nature of the existing legislative environment. But other than that, there is very little space to move. And we have just seen too many cases being struck down where organs of state have legitimately tried to do more, but were unsuccessful. I don't know if there's any other view on that from anyone.
Thank you, Dr. Peter. And he has opened the floor to questions to say that I don't know if there's any other view from the room. I'll take a moment to allow anyone who'd like to share.
Perhaps while we are waiting, can I add one more point? And that relates to I am somewhat concerned about the PPPFA circular that has come out recently. For those of you who are familiar with the chaos that followed the Agribusiness case, the question is, was the 2017 are they still valid? Are they invalid? Can we still operate within those regulations? And you will recall that the DG at one point even said, don't do any more procurement until we've got clarity on these issues. And in the subsequent case, the Constitutional Court said, but what was this? Why were you confused to begin with? There was no reason to be confused, because the Act is clear that the regulations will remain in place for a further period, the balance of the 1 year period, I think it's until January of next year, and there should not have been any confusion. But the problem is that some organs of state have issued tenders where they said, well, whilst all this confusion prevails, we are not going to apply the 2017 regulations until we get clarity on this. Now that we have clarity, the court said, but these regulations were binding on you throughout. There was no basis upon which you could be exempted or step out of these regulations. So I just want to highlight that is an area of vulnerability which organs of state will face based on having made decisions that they were unclear or uncertain about whether the 2017 regulations still apply or they don't apply. The court said they applied all along, and no one should have been confused or uncertain about any of this. I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Prior to Dr. Peter making a comment, I noticed that I think it's Oku, and excuse me if I have mispronounced it. You had yourself off mic, and I was not sure if you wanted to ask a question or not. I could have mispronounced it. Okay, perhaps I have mispronounced it, or they did not have a question. Are there any other questions from the room? Or not even questions, just comments that one would like to share? I am actually quite surprised that there aren't any comments, particularly as you said, with the confusion that has been around with regards to targeted procurement and the recent events. And furthermore, just because I can see that there are quite a few practitioners as well in the room, the challenges that we face in trying to implement targeted procurement. So I am quite surprised in terms of that.
Well, let me suggest that, you know, sometimes it is better to discuss an issue when we have a practical example, and more particularly when we have an actual piece of legislation that needs to be implemented. I think that we need to have a similar session when we see how targeted procurement measures are to be dealt with in the bill. And we understood from the the Minister of Finance's budget speech in February, I think it was, where he indicated that the new bill will be passed in the course still of this year. And it will give us a better opportunity to engage with applying these lessons that I've spoken about to the practicality of the legislation when it is passed. So perhaps we could have that engagement, but I see there is someone does have his hand up.
Matsepo, you are welcome to take yourself off mic.
Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues and Dr. Pizza. I joined the meeting late because I was running late from another meeting, and I might have missed some of the critical discussions that has happened with regard to the Concord ruling. I wanted to check the PPPFA and the current the recent Concord challenges that we had as practitioners has mostly been, or the provisions has mostly been applied in the public sector, or what you call your national departments. Is there somewhere where there would be a discussion in terms of how the legislature sector is because we're not regulated as such. So we've got our own act that is controlling how we're dealing with that. But there are some provisions that we are applying in terms of the PPPFA and the PPR in our policies. However, as Peter has indicated, there were this confusion as to who does it apply. We all organs of state, however, where we're not fully controlled by the PPPFA, how has that been brought into the picture to assist practitioners in the legislature sector to also be able to, align to what I will term, in my view, best practices that national departments are doing in this area? Thanks, Ayanda.
Thanks for that. That's a very interesting question. If I understood it correctly, Matsepo comes from one of the legislatures, either provincial or national legislature, and not a governmental department. And she was concerned about how this actually applies in the context of the legislatures. It's a fascinating question, and I think that we must be mindful of what an organ of state is. And the PPPFA, of course, applies to all organs of state. And it says, and I'm just reading from the Constitution as to what an organ of state is. It says it means any department of state or administration in the national, provincial, or local sphere of government, or any other functionary or institution which exercises a power or performs a function in terms of the Constitution or a provincial constitution. So it isn't just, in other words, the concept of what an organ of state is is not limited to a department of state in the national, provincial, or local sphere of government. It also includes any other institution which exercises a power or a function in terms of the constitution or a provincial constitution. And it goes on to talk about any institution exercising a power or performing a public function in terms of any legislation, but it doesn't include a court or a judicial officer. So they are excluded from the concept of organs of state. So look, I must tell you that I have always worked on the basis that even the legislature would be regarded as an organ of state. And the PPPFA, in fact, in its definition of what an organ of state is, it is also worded quite widely. I would be cautious, let's say, before concluding too readily that the PPPFA has no application at all. And in fact, proceed on the assumption that it does until there is a clear ruling to the effect that it doesn't apply. There was some debate recently about universities. Are universities subject to the procurement legislation? There are some cases that said, no, they are not covered by PPPFA, but that question has now been reopened by a recent case that said, no, even universities can't claim that they fall outside of the ambit of the PPPFA. So it has wide application, and I would suggest that you just reflect a bit with your colleagues and perhaps get a considered opinion on this matter as well.
Thank you very much, Matsepo, for that question and also for the response, Dr. Peter. Yeah. I'm going to ask for the, okay, there is a question. This question has come on the chat to say that from a legal point of view, when is preferential procurement acceptable?
Well, you know, the answer is it is only acceptable if it fits within the four walls of the existing legislation. In other words, preferential procurement can only be done if it fits within the four walls of the PPPFA. You will, if you've read that minority judgment of the Constitutional Court, they disagree. They say, no, you can't put the PPPFA above the Constitution. It must be the other way around. The PPPFA is subject to the Constitution, and it is the Constitution that sets the tone and permits a broader approach to preferential procurement. But we know now that that view was not fully endorsed by the majority. My own view, and perhaps it is a more risk-averse view. Others may have a different view on the matter. But the question is, from a legal point of view, when is preferential procurement acceptable? I will say currently, if it stays within the ambit of the existing legislation. That is the simple answer that I can give to that question. Thank you.
It's a simple but a difficult answer, because I think the challenge that we have is that trying to understand trying to interpret that existing legislation. I think that is, you know, one of the challenges that we have, but correctly so. I mean, we must operate within that legislation when we look at preferential procurement. So thank you very much for that. I trust that you have been answered in terms of the question that came in the chat.
Can I just add, none of these answers are satisfactory from a transformation point of view, because that is what we are ultimately concerned about here. What will work best from a transformation agenda. And to refer you back to the PPPFA and the 80-20 and the 90-10 is a entirely unsatisfactory answer, in my own view, from a developmental point of view. But, you know, from a legality point of view and working with what we have, I would say that there is a high risk and a low risk option. The low risk is to say we will operate within this legislation until we have new legislation which empowers us to do what we think should be done. That is the low risk option. The high risk option is let us test the envelope, let us push the boundaries, let the matter go back to court, and perhaps the court will interpret this legislation in accordance with how the minority judgment has read it as well. If you've got an appetite for high risk options, then by all means. But if you have an appetite for low risk options, then now is perhaps not the best time to follow that route.
Thanks for that. A further consideration from the chat is that someone from the universities has said, I was not aware that universities too are now considered as being guided by the PPPFA. Does this necessitate? Hello? Yes?
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Okay. So the question says, does this necessitate revision of the SCM policies in universities to align? If so, should we wait for the revised Procurement Act or immediately amend as per the current Act?
Let me just say that there is a judgment which I have come across a recent, when I say recent, within the last year or so, where this issue has come up again. There have been previous judgments from the High Court where they seem to express the view that the PPPFA doesn't extend to universities. My understanding of the more recent judgment is that universities are not excluded, but you've got contesting pronouncements of the courts from different high courts, and there's no definitive pronouncement from the SCA or the Constitutional Court on the matter. If the person who asked the question wants to follow up with me, I can refer them to that judgment. I just don't have it offhand right now, but they could be in touch with me, and I can let them have a look at the judgment and see whether they will get any benefit from that. I have no difficulty with that.
Okay, thank you very much. We will Aiska will put them in touch with you should they want to take it further. Another question or comment, I'd say, from the chat, is that I have realized the approach to using preferential procurement. It is quite different from the one used in Uganda. I'm going to ask, well, I'm taking this comment a little bit further to ask if, yes, there are definite lessons that have been learned in South Africa. If there was one or two key things that you would suggest for the rest of the continent, or in reverse, something that others on the rest of the continent may be doing better in terms of targeted procurement that we could perhaps utilize in South Africa, Dr. Peter?
Whether there are lessons we can learn from other parts of the continent?
Yes, one or two. I'm sure there are many, but maybe one or two. Or that
Look, I think Professor Ambe is probably closer to this issue, and if he is still in the meeting, he may wish to come in here. But I know that in Namibia, they have passed a Public Procurement Act a couple of years ago, but they place a very strong emphasis on preference for local suppliers. So Namibian-owned, Namibian registered entities are the ones who benefit from either a margin of preference, or in fact, in some cases, it is exclusive preference. So hard set-asides can be done in favor of entities originating from Namibia. The Zimbabwean case also comes to mind. They have what they call indigenization legislation, in terms of which the Zimbabwean, indigenous Zimbabwean entities are to be preferred, and only if there is no Namibian or Zimbabwean entity who meets the qualifications of the tender, then it can be extended to a broader audience. So it's interesting that the Namibian path and the Zimbabwean path places a great deal of emphasis on localization, on locally registered entities, which is not to say that they don't give any preference for race or for gender, but they have a very strong emphasis on localization. Prof, I'm not sure if you want to come in on this.
Thanks for that, Dr. Peter. Prof. Ambe had to excuse himself, so he won't be able to respond right. But we've also noted where the question is coming from, and we'll be able to follow up on that.
Yes.
I'm going to allow for one last question from the chat, because we do need to look at wrapping up. I see that it's nearing 5 o'clock and people are also leaving because I'm sure they've got other engagements. So the last question from the chat is that in the context of private-public partnerships, PPPs, do, for example, the financing the financing entity still have a leg to stand upon and insist on specific targets for emerging suppliers? So this particular question in the chat is really around the PPPs, and do they have a leg to stand in with regards to some specific targets?
I hope I'm understanding it correctly. But, PPPs, that is we can call it the neglected cousin of public procurement. It's governed by its own set of rules. It isn't exactly the same as public procurement, and so one mustn't easily draw lessons from public procurement to PPPs. But they haven't received the attention of the public procurement community that it should have. Having said that, I think we must be mindful of the AXA versus Imperial judgment, where the SEA said it doesn't matter whether you are procuring services from the bidding community, in other words, where you are paying for services, or whether it is a revenue generating transaction where you are actually receiving money. If you are contracting, what section 2171 says is if an organ of state contracts for goods or services, then it must do so in accordance with certain principles that are outlined in that section. And I would say that although this hasn't been fully tested in the courts as yet, one has to be careful with PPPs, because although they are not classic procurement transactions, they certainly are quasi-procurement and they do result in revenue generating transactions. So whether this is dealing with Mr. Ngube's question, I'm not entirely certain, but the broad principle would be that the 2171 and all the principles encapsulated in 2171 and PPPFA needs to be kept in mind when you deal with PPPs as well. So don't work on the assumption that they are entirely separate from what we have seen in the procurement space.
Thank you very much. I do think that you have dealt with it by one, just separating in terms of where do PPPs fall within the space. I do think you have dealt with it. Thank you. If not, Mr. Ngube, you are welcome to directly ask the question and take yourself off mute. With that, as I indicated, it is coming to 5 o'clock. I wanted to take this opportunity to really thank you, Dr. Peter, for your insights in terms of targeted procurement and allowing us to actually take that journey in terms of where we've been, where we are trying to get to, and some of the challenges that we come across in terms of targeted procurement, and also what we need to look out for. Really insightful discussion. Thank you very, very much for your time. I hope we will be able to share your slides with those that requested through AISCA, because I can see that there was a lot of information there that I think would be very useful, not only to the practitioners, but to general people working within the space and dealing with in supply chain in general. So thank you very, very much. Much appreciated. Also from Professor Ambe. Really thank you very much for your time and look forward to calling you again when it's time to actually unpack in terms of for the public comments. Really looking forward to that. I don't know if you want to say one or two things before you close.
Just from my side, it was an absolute pleasure to be part of this engagement. I always love speaking on these topics and teaching procurement law, not just in theoretical concepts, but particularly how it applies to practical problems. You know, the average procurement practitioner wants to know, how can I deal with this situation that I am confronted with? How do I apply the law to this reality that is on my desk? And as much as I like the theory of procurement law, what I enjoy more is the practical application of it in a fact-sensitive situation. So thank you very much, and I hope it has been of benefit to some extent. Please, Ayanda, do share the slides, and if anyone wants to raise a question with me directly, I'm sure you can make my email available, but it is peter.volmink@gmail.com, as simple as that. Volmink is VOLMINK, and you are welcome to communicate directly with me should you need to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for opening that door for us and for everyone else in the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That, all right then. Thank you. With that, I'll say thank you and see you all in last Tuesday of the month. So see you all next month. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.